In many cases, one-touch join will be added as a feature to an existing Pexip Infinity deployment which is already used as a calling platform. In this scenario, the OTJ process runs on conferencing nodes alongside other Pexip Infinity services. You can also set up separate OTJ locations within your existing deployment that contain conferencing nodes used solely for one-touch join functionality. Another option, appropriate in some situations, is to implement a completely separate Pexip Infinity deployment purely for one-touch join. For example, you are a Pexip service customer wishing to use one-touch join. Another example is that you are a large enterprise wishing to separate the resources used for your one-touch join deployment from the calling platform. For OTJ to function, Infinity requires an integration to a supported email platform to obtain access to the room resource mailboxes associated to the VC endpoints, to allow viewing and processing of any meeting invites. When meeting invites are processed and matches one of the supported meeting types, Infinity helps to populate the calendar of the endpoint with the meeting info, and most importantly, the alias to dial by pressing the join button. At a high level, Infinity is acting as a calendar or meeting broker between the email system and the endpoints. Once configured correctly, it is the conferencing nodes which connect to the email system and populate the meeting information on the endpoints. The management node is only used for configuration of OTJ, it's the conferencing nodes which do the work. Note that the OTJ process is available on conferencing nodes, regardless of the role, transcoding or proxying edge. There are three ways in which an endpoint will receive its meeting information from Infinity. It largely depends on the endpoint. For Cisco endpoints, the endpoint calendar is populated by pushing or uploading the meeting information to the calendar via an API command. When OTJ needs to push a meeting to a Cisco endpoint, it can make the API call directly to the endpoint to populate the calendar. Cisco WebEx registered endpoints are also supported. These devices still require the meeting information to be pushed out to them. However, for WebEx registered endpoints, rather than Infinity directly populating the endpoint calendar, the meeting is populated by making an API call to WebEx Cloud, then WebEx will push the meeting information to the endpoint. In contrast, Poly endpoints are different to Cisco in that they expect to communicate directly with an Exchange server to pull down their own calendar information. Rather than configuring the Poly device to use Exchange for calendaring, its config is instead pointed toward the Infinity nodes to request calendar information. The nodes only communicate with the Poly devices after they are first contacted by the endpoint. If the endpoint is not on the same network as the OTJ conferencing nodes, for example, in a home office behind NAT, the networking needs to be considered to ensure that the endpoint can communicate with Infinity. Poly endpoints tend to be fine behind a NAT without additional configuration, as they make requests outbound towards the conferencing nodes. Cisco endpoints need to receive an API call to populate their calendar, and would likely need to configure port forwarding on their local router. One-touch join is a licensed feature within the Pexip Infinity platform. The quantity of licenses required must match the number of endpoints you wish to configure for OTJ. The length of time taken for a meeting to appear on the corresponding room endpoint depends on a number of factors, but is largely due to the number of endpoints in your deployment. In general, for deployments of around 170 endpoints or fewer, the one-touch join service will poll room resource calendars with a maximum frequency of every 30 seconds. It does not poll any more frequently than this to avoid impacting the performance of conferencing nodes. Cisco endpoints will be updated after each poll if a meeting change is detected, and meetings are re-pushed to Cisco endpoints once per hour. Poly endpoints will generally connect to the conferencing node to get updates every minute, but this will depend on the Poly configuration. As you add more endpoints, one-touch join will reduce the frequency of requests correspondingly. For a deployment of 4,000 endpoints, the maximum supported number, endpoints will be updated around every 12 minutes. This is because both Microsoft Exchange and Google limit the number of API requests that can be made to their calendar services in a 24-hour period. It is possible to change the 24-hour quota to increase the frequency of endpoint updates in larger deployments. Refer to the docs for more information. All conferencing nodes in your deployment can run the OneTouch Join service. However, the service will be in active operation on only those nodes that belong to a location that has been associated with an OTJ endpoint group, and when that endpoint group has been associated with an OTJ profile. Within each such location, a maximum of 5 conferencing nodes will actively read room resource calendars and process meeting information. Responsibility for each room resource is spread across these nodes in order to balance the workload and provide redundancy. Should one node become unavailable, for example, if it is put into maintenance mode or loses connectivity, the other nodes will take over responsibility for its room resources. However, if there are one or more poly endpoints in the location, the OneTouch Join service on all nodes within the location will handle requests from poly endpoints. Therefore, round-robin DNS records are required for all nodes in a location that has poly endpoints. Alternatively, you can set up system locations that will be used specifically for OneTouch Join. These can be in the same physical locations as your existing conferencing nodes, but their resources will be dedicated to OneTouch Join.